So let's move into the second point here. And this point is about the general benefits. General benefits of using libraries. Now, understand I am generalizing here. Not every library is going to give you this benefit, and we're going to talk about the problems frameworks can give you, and not every library is going to give you problems. I apologize. I will probably be using the word framework and library interchangeably. That's just how my brain works. Sometimes I use the wrong word. Deal with it. So let's get started here. So number one, first benefit of using libraries, and this should be pretty familiar. So a good library hides the implementation details, the code necessary to solve a problem. And in technical, let me zoom out a little bit. That's probably big enough. In technical terms, a library adds a layer of abstraction over the solution to a problem. So what is an example? We'll use the example that I just showed you earlier. The purpose of a recycler view is so that I do not need to implement the view holder pattern myself. Does that mean I can't implement the view holder pattern myself? No, I could learn how to do that. I'm sure anyone watching this could. But in this particular case, I'm not interested in solving that problem. The recycler view in particular, I find is a very good library. It doesn't take over my whole architecture, and it solves a problem that is pretty common in my applications. So this is an example, in my opinion, and everyone has different opinions, of a good library. Okay, so that's one of the points. A good library hides implementation details necessary to solve a problem. In other words, a good library, to put it in really simple terms, can be plugged in and used even sometimes by junior developers. Sometimes some of these problems are really complicated, and if you're a junior developer, you just want a solution that you can figure out relatively quickly and then get some meaningful programs working. I'm sure if any of you have any experience in web development, you'll be familiar with libraries which allow you to basically build the framework or the basics of a website in like 5 minutes by typing a couple imports. And here's another point. So a good library, depending on what your goals are, can solve many problems at the same time. And here we're getting back into framework land, because this is what frameworks like RxJava do. So in the case of RxJava, it is simultaneously an implementation, a version of the observer pattern, the publisher subscriber thing, a threading, let's just say, I apologize if my English is a bit off here. It is simultaneous an implementation of the observer pattern, a threading mechanism. You can do concurrency with RxJava, and it allows a functional, depending on how you define that, style of method chains, and functional functions like map and all those kinds of things that we tend to see in functional languages. So this is what I'm talking about. It can solve many problems at the same time, but here's the thing about that, and this is where we'll get into the next main point here. Sometimes that's a bad thing. So here's point number 2 about this. So what are the problems that can arise from using frameworks? So hopefully you watched my story or listened to my story from earlier where I explained this exact situation and how I completely failed a coding challenge because I basically used too many frameworks and didn't know how to solve problems without them. To generalize a bit. And understand the examples I'm going to give you here, it's going to depend on the library and the framework. I'm generalizing. So one important thing to remember is that very often the details that these tools hide from you are worth learning to become a good developer. So sometimes this isn't the case. I'm not overly interested in manually implementing the view holder pattern itself, but recently I did basically make my own simplified version of RxJava. I made an implementation of the publisher subscriber pattern or observer pattern. And that was worth doing. I learned a lot from doing that. Here's a more important technical point when it comes to software development life cycle. So frameworks or libraries tend to change frequently, and if you've spent more than like 2 years in any platform, you've noticed that almost every 6 to 12 months there's a new framework that does what the old frameworks do, and everyone gets excited about it and they think it's the best thing. And then 6 months later or a year later, another new framework comes out. So frameworks and libraries tend to change frequently, whereas platforms and languages tend to change much less frequently. So if I solve a problem with a library or framework, I will tend to have more upkeep. I will have to keep updating version numbers. I might have more frequent application breaking changes, although in fairness that can come from platform updates too. I've had that happen too. But the point is, it's less upkeep if you implement the solution yourself oftentimes, as opposed to using the framework or library. And here's another point. So just to summarize this, your code becomes more resistant to change is the goal there. And let's talk about the elephant in the room. And this might anger a few people, but I'm just going to speak the truth as I see it. Sometimes, and Dagger is a perfect example, and I know they have Hilt out now, whatever. Sometimes using a library is, oops, did I spell that? Yes, I did spell that right, is a gigantic waste of time. Now, that's going to piss some people off. Let me explain what I mean, because I do mean something specifically. Okay, if you are building a small app to learn Dagger 2, that is good. I encourage that. Build a simple application to learn a complicated tool so that you only have to worry about learning the tool and not worrying about building a complicated application. I strongly encourage that. Okay, if you are building a small app, otherwise, let's add that in there. Otherwise, if you're building a small app that uses Dagger 2, then you are basically, let me scroll down so my face isn't blocking anything, then you're basically doing something like driving a tank to go pick up groceries. It is just complete overkill. You will give yourself extra work for no benefit. The code that Dagger 2 would generate for you in a small application is simpler to write by hand. It's very simple. Let me show you what it looks like right off the bat. You write a little class called, what do I usually call it? Build logic. And this is, in a nutshell, what Dagger 2 does for you. You give it a view or some context or something, you build the different parts of your application, and you want to pull this code out into either a separate class or some tool like Dagger 2. And Dagger 2 basically creates a more complicated, automated version of exactly what you see here. I've even used the similar naming conventions. So that's a really important point here. if you're doing it for a learning project, by all means do that. Don't use tools like that in small applications because it's really not to your benefit. Again, maybe you want to keep your skills sharp or you have a specific reason why you're doing that. That's okay. That's good. But understand that sometimes it's a giant waste of time. And one more benefit here. By using fewer third-party libraries, we can drastically reduce the memory size of our applications. And sometimes that is critically important. If you have a very big application, you probably need to be worrying about the APK size or jar size. In Android, we use APKs, but in other Java land, we use jars often, or WAR files even. So actually, maybe I think it's called a WAR file in Java EE, but it's been a few years. So this is, kind of the final point here. So I'm almost done. We got one more point and we'll get through this pretty quickly. Then we'll get to Q&A. So how do we mitigate? This is kind of an English word for my ESL friends. It means like reduce. How do we, actually let's say that. How do we reduce the problems that can arise? Is that a Z? I can't remember. From good old English language. How do we reduce the problems that can arise from using frameworks? Well, if you've ever looked at Uncle Bob's work, he taught me about this originally. Keep frameworks in particular at arm's length. So don't let them take over your entire architecture unless you're sure that that's what you want to do. And so what I mean by that in code is that because I have, in this old application, decided to use RxJava as my primary framework for communicating data across the application, if I decide to switch to a different tool, or hypothetically I find out that RxJava doesn't work for me, then I need to do a gigantic refactor because I'm literally refactoring the framework of my application. So that's a really important point, and this is a reason why you have to be careful using those kinds of things. Here's a general prescription. Keep frameworks / libraries at the extremes of your architecture and not in the middle. So, we can use UI frameworks, which would be the front end. Use databases / network adapters. I don't care. Use Room, use Realm, use Retrofit, or don't. But keep these things on the extremes. So we have like the front end, and then we have like the middle stuff, which it depends on how you define that, and then we have the back end. And these middle classes, and we could consider like a presenter or a view model. Like nowadays when I write these things, you won't see a single third-party library in my presenter. That's basically what this is. You won't see third-party libraries in my view models. That's right. I basically no longer use Android view model. I'm not saying it's a bad library. I just don't really use it. You'll never see me communicating across an important architectural boundary of my application using live data or paging. You'll never see that because I'm just not even interested in doing that anymore. I've learned how to go without that. So I think that's basically all I wanted to say. And the final point, I mentioned this earlier, but by choosing not to rely too, I really hope I wasn't in webcam mode, good. By choosing not to rely too much on frameworks, you will learn a lot. Now, for the junior developers listening to this, if you have your frameworks and you like them and they solve problems that you're not really comfortable solving on your own at this stage in your career, that's okay. I'm not trying to replace one dogmatic opinion with another dogmatic opinion. I'm just trying to give you my perspective on this topic and why, you know, several senior Android or senior developers throughout my career when I was a junior developer would say this. They would say, don't let these things just take over your entire development process. And by going through that example of just completely failing a coding challenge, because I couldn't do some very basic things in Android using only the Android SDK and the Java standard library, that really taught me exactly why keep your frameworks, keep your libraries at arm's length. And that is a saying by Uncle Bob. I don't want to make it sound like I made that up. Hopefully, I'm using quotes. I might be paraphrasing, but I think that's what he said.